August 15, 2021. The Taliban entered Kabul. Many believed the decades of open warfare had finally ended. They were wrong. Behind closed doors and away from official press conferences, a new phase of terror began. This campaign targeted one group: women. What was captured on hidden cameras? Most of the world saw the official propaganda, but secret, uncensored footage tells a different story. It shows a systematic removal of human rights. The footage is clear. Armed men patrol the streets with whips and steel cables. They stop women for the length of their sleeves. They check the color of their shoes. If the code is broken, the punishment is immediate. The sound of a strike against leather is audible in the recordings. The victims do not scream. They know that silence is the only way to survive the encounter. How did the world react? At first, there were diplomatic statements and empty promises. But the reality on the ground remained unchanged. The footage reveals a cruelty so calculated that it functions like a machine. It is not random violence. It is a signal to every household in the country. The cameras record empty classrooms. Chairs are stacked against the walls. Chalkboards remain blank. Education for girls above the 6th grade stopped overnight. This was not a temporary measure. It was a total erasure of the future. The images show women waiting in long lines for bread. Their faces are covered. Their movement is restricted to a few blocks around their homes. Without a male guardian, they cannot enter a shop or board a bus. The footage tracks the disappearance of female faces from billboards and storefronts. Painters use white rollers to cover the eyes of women in advertisements. This was only the beginning. The secret recordings continue to surface. They show night raids and the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors. It is a documentary of a disappearing society. The footage remains the only proof of what is happening behind the curtain of the new regime. The world watches the pixels. The evidence is undeniable. December 1979. The Soviet Union moved its 40th Army across the border. They came to prop up a failing communist regime in Kabul. This was not a quick intervention. It was the start of a decade of total destruction. How did a local conflict become a national grave? The answer is simple: total war. Soviet bombs leveled thousand-year-old villages. Soldiers burned wheat fields and orchards. Landmines replaced roads. By February 1989, the Soviet withdrawal began. The cost was staggering. 1 million Afghans were dead. Millions more carried shrapnel in their bodies or lost limbs to explosives. Families abandoned their homes with only the clothes on their backs. 5 million people crossed the borders into Pakistan and Iran. They moved into massive cities of mud and canvas. These refugee camps became permanent homes. Children grew up in the dirt without opening a textbook. Parents spent decades waiting for a peace that never came. A whole generation became experts only in survival. Inside the country, the map was empty. Hundreds of villages simply ceased to exist. Families waited for sons and fathers who never returned from the mountains. In the footage from February 1989, the last Soviet tanks crossed the Friendship Bridge. People hoped the nightmare ended there. It did not. April 1992. The pro-Soviet government in Kabul collapsed, but peace did not follow the fall of the regime. Instead, Afghanistan spiraled into a fractured civil war. Former allies who fought the Soviets now turned guns on each other. Warlords divided the country into fiefdoms. They fought street by street for every city block. Kabul transformed into a graveyard. Between 1992 and 1996, rockets and heavy artillery hit residential neighborhoods daily. The sounds of whistling shells and crashing masonry became constant. 50,000 civilians died in the capital alone. The camera captures the ruins, hollowed-out schools, burnt hospitals, and rubble-strewn markets. There were no functioning courts. There was no central police force. Only the law of the gun remained. Armed groups set up checkpoints every few miles. Militiamen dragged passengers from buses at gunpoint. They searched homes without warrants, taking whatever they wanted. Anyone could be labeled an enemy and executed on the spot. For women, the environment became a prison. The threat of kidnapping was constant. Fighters took women from the streets by force. Mothers barred their doors and kept their daughters in the shadows. Schools for girls closed because the walk to class was a death trap. Fear replaced the law. This was the foundation for what came next. The rule of law vanished. There were no courts and no police. Ordinary citizens found themselves pinned between rival militias that viewed human life as a resource. Kabul and the provinces became a meat grinder. The population was drained. People no longer debated politics or dreamed of democratic freedoms. They wanted the artillery fire to cease. They wanted the constant fear of random death to end. They reached a point where they would accept anyone who could impose order. This vacuum was the catalyst. 1994. Into this void stepped the Taliban. They did not begin with a grand invasion. They started quietly in the city of Kandahar. The city was a landscape of ruins and shell-pocked concrete. It served as a monument to failed governance. Warlords held every major intersection. They set up illegal checkpoints. Truck drivers faced robbery or execution on every trip. Kidnappings were a daily reality. Girls were abducted from classrooms. Families watched this happen and had no way to fight back. The footage from this era shows the faces of the fighters. Most were teenagers. These were young men raised in the dirt of Pakistani refugee camps. They had never seen peace. They grew up with the sound of Kalashnikovs and the sight of empty chairs where fathers or brothers used to sit. For them, life was not nuanced. It was binary. There was only right and wrong. There was only total obedience or immediate punishment. Who led them? A man named Mullah Muhammad Omar. He was a veteran of the war against the Soviet Union. Shrapnel had taken his right eye during the fighting. Omar did not give televised speeches. He did not live in a palace. He stayed in the shadows and avoided the camera. This silence created a myth. His followers did not just see a commander. They saw a figure chosen by fate to cleanse the country. They gave him a title, Amir al-Mu'minin. It was a signal of absolute religious and military authority. The order they brought was cold, but for a desperate population, it was order. Events accelerated. The movement began to move toward the capital. There was no turning back. Thus, the new regime began to take shape. A promise of safe roads and zero corruption. That was the initial offer. The Taliban enforced a strict religious legal system. Local support grew in the early days. They disarmed the local warlords, stopped highway robberies, and removed the illegal checkpoints. For a population exhausted by constant fear, it looked like stability. But this order carried a heavy price. September 27, 1996. The Taliban entered Kabul. The city offered almost no resistance. Years of civil war had drained the people of the will to fight. Thousands of fighters moved through the streets on pickup trucks. What happened to the former leadership? The answer came quickly. That same afternoon, fighters reached the United Nations compound. Former President Mohammad Najibullah had lived there in hiding for years. They dragged him out. Najibullah was beaten and executed. His body was hanged from a traffic light in the city center for everyone to see. Within 48 hours, the lives of women changed. New decrees were broadcast over the radio. The enforcement was immediate. Women were forbidden from leaving their houses without a male relative to escort them. Every girls' school in the country was ordered to close. Female teachers lost their positions. Women working in government offices, international aid organizations, and hospitals were fired on the spot. Journalists were removed from their desks. Family incomes vanished in a single day. The regime created a specialized police force. It was titled the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Officers patrolled every district. They were armed with wooden sticks, thick cables, and leather whips. The footage from this era shows the reality. Patrols stopped women at random on the street. If a burqa was deemed too short, they administered a beating. If a woman's shoes made a clicking sound on the pavement, she was punished. Events accelerated. If a woman's skin was visible for even a second, the consequences were violent. There was no turning back. Thus began a new era of absolute control. 160 decibels. That was the volume of a shout that could lead to a public lashing. If a woman spoke too loudly or appeared nervous in public, the consequences were immediate. She was accused of bad behavior and beaten on the spot. There were no warnings. There was no process for appeal. Punishment occurred in full view of the public. Streets transformed into zones of absolute fear. Markets became high-risk territory. Women adapted by keeping their heads down and moving at a rapid pace. The goal was to remain invisible. The camera would show thousands of women in blue burqas moving like ghosts through the dust. Hospitals became scenes of avoidable tragedy. The regime banned female doctors from practicing their profession. Simultaneously, they forbade women from receiving treatment from male doctors. The result was a total collapse of healthcare for half the population. Pregnant women arrived at clinic doors and were turned away. Minor infections became fatal. Childbirth turned into a gamble with death. By 1997, health organizations recorded a staggering statistic. The maternal mortality rate climbed to 1,600 deaths per 100,000 births. Women died in silence behind closed doors. They were too terrified to seek medical help. At first glance, it was a health crisis. But in reality, it was a systematic erasure. By 1997, the Taliban moved their violence out of the shadows. They stopped punishing women in back alleys or hidden cells. Public execution and torture became the primary tools of the state. For the Taliban, fear was the only mechanism of governance. Visible pain ensured total obedience. If the public watched a neighbor being beaten in the town square, they followed the rules without question. Markets and busy intersections became theaters of violence. One location became the symbol of this era: Ghazi Stadium in Kabul. Locals still use the name Kabul Sports Stadium, but the history of the concrete stands is dark. It was the designated site for mass public spectacles of punishment. The schedule was fixed. Every Friday, after the main prayer services, the crowds gathered. People poured out of the mosques and into the stadium seats. Taliban officials would take the microphones to announce the day's sentences. Events accelerated. The stadium was no longer for sports. The sound of a whistle was replaced by the sound of a gunshot. The grass was no longer for athletes. It was for the condemned. The authorities delivered the verdicts. Loudspeakers announced the event days in advance. The Taliban ordered the public to attend. These were not small gatherings. Witness accounts confirm the scale. Tens of thousands of people packed the concrete stands of Ghazi Stadium. Why did the crowds gather? It was not for sport. It was for a display of absolute power. The stadium became a theater of violence. Women accused of crimes were led to the center of the pitch. The charges were often vague: adultery, running away from home, disobeying a male relative. There were no defense lawyers. There were no formal trials. Taliban commanders or religious judges issued verdicts in minutes. There was no process for appeal. Once the word was spoken, the punishment followed immediately. November 16, 1999. This date remains a dark marker in Kabul's history. A woman named Zarmina was brought to the center of Ghazi Stadium. The accusation: she killed her husband with a hammer during a domestic dispute. The Taliban held her in a cell for 3 years. Then they decided it was time for a spectacle. This was one of the first public executions of a woman under their regime. The footage shows the arrival. A vehicle drives onto the grass. Zarmina exits the car. She wears a blue burqa that masks her face and body. 2 female officers, also covered in burqas, grip her arms. They lead her to the center of the field. The crowd is silent. A young Taliban fighter stands behind her. He carries a Kalashnikov rifle. He racks the bolt. Zarmina is forced to kneel on the dirt. The gunman fires 3 rounds into the back of her head at point-blank range. Thousands of children watched from the stands. Their parents brought them because the Taliban broadcast the execution time on the radio for days. One woman in the crowd hid a camera under her clothing. She risked her life to record the killing. The grainy video was smuggled across the border. It became the primary evidence of the regime's brutality. To the world, it was a horror. To those inside Afghanistan, it was a daily reality. Obedience was not a choice, it was a survival tactic. Openly protesting meant facing the same fate as Zarmina. The stadium saw more than just executions, it was a factory of pain. Guards performed amputations on those accused of theft. They used cables to flog women for moral offenses like immodesty. Human Rights Watch documented the pattern. The violence was random. It was designed to keep the population in a state of constant fear. Age provided no shield. Teenagers were beaten alongside adults. Intent was irrelevant. Accidents were punished as deliberate crimes. 2000. Herat. A crowded bazaar. Witnesses describe a woman in her early 30s. Her crime was laughing while speaking to another woman. A Taliban member approached. He struck her repeatedly with a thick cable. He did not stop until she collapsed onto the pavement. The bazaar was full of people. No one moved to help her. No one spoke out. In this system, mercy was a crime. Stepping forward meant being the next person on the ground. Thus, the silence continued. 1996. This was the year the streets of Kabul went silent. After witnessing public beatings, many women stayed inside their homes for days or weeks. Some stopped leaving altogether. Kabul was once a city full of women working in offices, shopping in markets, and studying at the university. It became a place where women disappeared from public life. The Taliban never tried to hide these punishments. Beatings were meant to be seen. It was a signal to the population. But while the violence was public, cameras were banned. The regime considered photography and video immoral. Anyone caught filming risked arrest. They faced severe beatings, long imprisonment, or public execution. Why did anyone take the risk? Because the world needed to see. Despite the danger, some people recorded the atrocities. One woman successfully filmed the execution of Zarmina in the National Stadium. But the most important footage came from RAWA. This was the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. It was founded in 1977. RAWA opposed both the Soviet occupation and Taliban rule. During the late 1990s, members used hidden cameras. They carried them under their burqas. They risked their lives every time they pressed the record button. In 1999, RAWA released a specific video from Kabul. It shows a woman being beaten in the street. Her crime was lifting her burqa to beg for food. The footage is shaky but clear. Taliban officers strike her repeatedly with wooden sticks. Bystanders stand frozen. No one intervenes. The sound of the strikes is audible. RAWA members smuggled the tape out through Pakistan. They showed it to journalists, human rights groups, and the United Nations. At first glance, it was just one video. But in reality, it was a turning point. For many outside Afghanistan, this was the first undeniable proof of daily life under the Taliban. It showed the world the reality of their rule. Inside the country, nothing changed. The beatings continued. Public violence remained the regime's most effective tool of control. But this was only the beginning. On September 11, 2001, everything changed. The attacks in the United States shocked the world. 19 hijackers changed the course of history. The Taliban had been sheltering Osama bin Laden. He was the leader of al-Qaeda and the mastermind behind the strikes. The world turned its eyes toward Afghanistan. There was no turning back. October 7, 2001. On this day, the first missiles hit Afghanistan. The Taliban had refused to surrender the planners of the September 11th attacks. This refusal turned a diplomatic standoff into a full-scale invasion. American and coalition aircraft launched strikes against military bases, communication centers, and training camps across the country. Why did the regime collapse so quickly? It seemed they were prepared for war, but the combined pressure of air power and ground rebels was too much. Northern Alliance fighters moved in from the north. They were a coalition of local militias who had waited years for this moment. They advanced toward Kabul, seizing one stronghold after another. The footage shows soldiers on old tanks and pickup trucks rushing toward the capital. By November 13, 2001, the Taliban vanished from the city. They didn't just retreat. They abandoned government offices, left airports wide open, and threw away their uniforms. The regime fell in weeks. There was no mistake. In the frame, empty streets and abandoned checkpoints. Fighters and high-ranking officials fled toward the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush or across the border into Pakistan. They took whatever weapons and cash they could carry. This was a shift for the capital. For the first time in 5 years, women walked through Kabul without male guardians. The camera records a historic sight: women removing their blue burqas in public. They stepped outside without hiding their faces. Girls walked to schools that had been shuttered since 1996. Hospitals, media offices, and government bureaus reopened their doors. Female doctors, journalists, and clerks returned to their desks. But the peace revealed a dark history. Hidden archives came to light. The world saw what life under the Taliban had really been like. New footage emerged from secret tapes and forgotten cameras. The clips showed public floggings, secret beatings in alleyways, and executions in stadiums. Between 1996 and 2001, Afghan women had lived under a system of total surveillance. There was no protection and no escape. The United Nations and Amnesty International began cataloging these crimes. They used the footage as evidence of systematic violence against civilians. But this was only a pause in the fighting. At first glance, the Taliban were defeated. But in reality, they were merely shifting. They retreated to rural provinces like Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan. In these remote areas, they began to regroup. They rebuilt their networks, recruited new fighters, and established a shadow government. They enforced their strict rules in villages where the new government couldn't reach. By the year 2010, their influence had expanded once again. The war was far from over. 2010. The Taliban did not hold Kabul, but they ruled the countryside. In villages and remote districts, they established a parallel government. They replaced state law with Sharia courts. These were not formal legal institutions. They were local tribunals based on a strict, fundamentalist interpretation of religious texts. Control required public displays of force. Women became the primary targets of these punishments. The objective was clear: total social obedience through fear. September 21, 2010. Takhar province in northeastern Afghanistan. A video file began to circulate on private networks. The footage is shaky and low resolution. It captures a woman kneeling on the dirt. Armed men surround her. These are Taliban fighters. The charge was adultery. The punishment was 100 lashes. In the video, the sound of the whip hitting fabric and flesh is distinct. The men count out loud. 1, 2, 3. They do not stop until they reach 100. The woman screams. A crowd of men stands in a circle, watching in silence. No one intervenes. The video went viral. For the international community, it was a wake-up call. It was physical proof that the brutal methods of the 1990s had returned. Human rights organizations archived the footage. They used it as primary evidence of a resurgent regime. But the violence escalated. 5 years later, 2015, Ghor province in western Afghanistan. This region is mountainous and isolated. A 19-year-old woman named Rukshana became the center of a global outcry. Her story began with a forced marriage. Her family had traded her away while she was still a child. In these rural zones, girls are treated as property to settle debts or seal alliances. Rukshana refused to submit. She fled with a young man she actually loved. They reached the mountains, but they didn't get far. Local fighters and family members tracked them down. They captured the couple and dragged them back to the village. The punishment for defiance was immediate. First, they forced Rukshana into a second marriage. The groom was an older man she had never met. She was a prisoner in her own home. She waited for an opening. She ran away a second time. There would be no third attempt. Rukshana and her fiancé Mohammed Gul fled their village. They wanted a life together. But local Taliban fighters and armed men stopped them. The capture was swift. The men separated the couple immediately. Rukshana was handed over to a group of elders and militants. Her fate was decided in minutes. A video later emerged of the execution. The footage shows Rukshana trapped in a hole in the ground. Only her head and shoulders are visible above the dirt. A group of men stands in a circle around her. They pick up heavy rocks and throw them at her head. The sound of stones hitting bone is audible. A small crowd of onlookers stands by and watches. Mohammed Gul did not die that day. Reports state he was lashed and released. The execution took place near Fidosko, the capital of Ghor province. It happened in a village where government authority did not exist. Local officials identified the killers as a mix of Taliban militants, religious leaders, and local warlords. It was a joint operation. Women's rights activists condemned the act. They called it a signal of what happens in regions beyond government control. Human rights groups confirmed the facts. Public stoning is not part of Afghan national law, yet the law meant nothing in the mountains. These killings in 2010 and 2015 were not isolated incidents. By the end of the 2010s, these punishments spread. Local news reports grew frequent. Public floggings became common. The crimes were simple: leaving home without a male guardian, talking to men, or fleeing a forced marriage. The moral police were back in the streets. August 15, 2021. The Taliban walked into Kabul. There was no battle. No shots were fired. The Afghan government collapsed in a single afternoon. President Ashraf Ghani boarded a plane and fled to the United Arab Emirates. The footage from the palace shows Taliban fighters sitting at the president's desk. They carried American-made rifles. The Afghan security forces simply vanished. Foreign troops were already at the airport, preparing to leave. The Taliban filled the power vacuum instantly. In the first weeks, the new leaders held press conferences. They spoke to international journalists. They promised a new era. They claimed they were more moderate than the regime of the 1990s. They promised women would have rights. They said girls could study. They told the world that the old violent punishments would not return. But the promises were words. The reality on the ground was different. August 2021. The Taliban took power and promised a new era. A few families felt hope. But hope has no place in a regime of control. By September 2021, the mask fell. It happened quietly. The Taliban shut down secondary schools for girls above grade 6 across nearly the entire country. Hundreds of thousands of teenage girls arrived at school gates only to find them locked. Some provinces tried to reopen classrooms. The Taliban shut them down again. Was this a temporary pause? No, it was a permanent ban. By early 2025, millions of girls remained trapped at home. Education for Afghan girls now ends at age 12. Afghanistan holds a grim record. It is the only nation on earth where girls cannot finish basic schooling. But the pressure did not stop at the school gates. It moved into the workplace. In December 2021, the orders arrived. Female workers were told to stay home. They lost their salaries and their status. The footage shows empty desks in government offices. Universities were next. First, they built walls inside classrooms to separate men and women. Then, they banned women from specific majors like medicine and engineering. By the end of 2022, the doors to higher education closed entirely. At first glance, a change in policy. But in reality, a total erasure of women from public life. Then came the physical violence. In November 2022, the Taliban returned to public punishments. In Tahrir province, 19 people stood before a crowd. The group included both men and women. The Taliban court delivered the sentence. Each person received between 25 and 39 lashes. The charges were moral violations. This meant adultery or simply running away from home. The sound of the whip returned to the town squares. In December 2022, a man and a woman in Farah province were led out in public. They were whipped for alleged adultery. Bystanders held up phones. They recorded the scene. The video spread online, showing the dust, the crowd, and the strike of the lash. Events accelerated. These were not isolated incidents. Throughout December, public floggings became a weekly routine across multiple provinces. In March 23, 12 more people were whipped in Logar province. 3 were women, 9 were men. The tally of lashes remained the same, 20 to 39. There was no turning back. In January 2024, 5 women in Badakhshan province were publicly whipped. The Taliban called it justice for moral crimes. In Samangan and Sar-e-Pol, judicial bodies used the lash to enforce dress codes and movement restrictions. The camera records a pattern of systematic brutality. Human rights groups and United Nations observers began counting the victims. By mid-2025, the numbers were staggering. More than 300 people were flogged in public in a single 6-month period. Some women were punished for a single reason. They left their homes without a male guardian. Others were whipped for speaking to men who were not their relatives. The regime's promises of moderation were officially dead. The world watched the footage. The era of broken promises was over.